They told him, "You don't belong here. First class isn't for people like you." 10 minutes later, every passenger sat in stunned silence, because the black man they had insulted had just grounded the entire plane. The airport was buzzing with its usual rhythm, rolling luggage wheels, the chatter of families, and the echo of flight announcements over the loudspeakers. Among the sea of travelers walked Marcus Johnson, tall and poised in his dark tailored suit. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, a presence that naturally drew attention. In his hand was a crisp first-class boarding pass, one he had purchased without hesitation. Marcus was no ordinary passenger. He was the CEO of Johnson Aerospace, a company known worldwide for its cutting-edge technology in aviation. Yet, to the strangers around him, he was just another man walking toward the gate. As Marcus entered the jet bridge and stepped into the first-class cabin, heads turned. Some greeted him politely, while others exchanged puzzled looks. He placed his briefcase in the overhead bin and settled comfortably into his leather seat, adjusting his watch as the flight attendants moved about preparing for takeoff. But the calm didn't last long. A middle-aged man in an expensive blazer, already seated nearby, gave him a sharp look. Then, with a smirk that cut through the air, he muttered, "First class isn't for everyone." The words were heavy with disdain, spoken loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. Some chuckled quietly, while others looked away, uncomfortable with the tension. A flight attendant, catching the remark, hesitated and walked over with a strained smile. "Excuse me, sir," she said carefully. "Are you sure this is your seat?" Marcus turned his head, his calm expression unshaken. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and handed her the ticket. His voice was steady but firm. "Yes, this is exactly where I belong." The flight attendant studied Marcus's ticket for a moment longer than necessary, her polite smile faltering as though she was searching for a mistake that didn't exist. Finally, she handed it back, but the doubt in her eyes lingered. The man in the blazer leaned back in his seat with a smug grin. "Probably a last-minute upgrade," he said loudly, making sure half the cabin heard him. His words carried the sting of arrogance and the ugly undertone of judgment. A couple of nearby passengers chuckled softly, while others lowered their eyes, too uncomfortable to intervene. Marcus, however, remained calm, his posture straight, his expression unchanged. He had dealt with such attitudes before, and he refused to let them control him. He slipped the ticket back into his jacket pocket and adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate composure. "I assure you," he replied evenly, "this is not a mistake." His voice carried a quiet strength that silenced the murmurs for a brief moment. But the man wasn't done. He gave a mocking laugh. "You don't exactly look like the type who flies first class." The insult hung heavy in the air. The attendant shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between her training and the pressure of the passenger's remarks. Marcus could feel the weight of eyes on him, judging, questioning, doubting. Yet, instead of snapping back, he simply folded his hands in his lap, his calmness a sharp contrast to the disrespect being thrown at him. Inside, he knew something no one else in that cabin did. Soon, their assumptions would crumble. But for now, he sat quietly, letting their ignorance speak louder than he ever needed to. The tension inside the cabin grew heavier with every passing minute. Marcus sat silently, his eyes focused ahead, while whispers and sideways glances circled around him like restless waves. The man in the blazer leaned back smugly, convinced he had made his point. But Marcus wasn't bothered. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped quickly on the screen. A brief message was sent, calm, precise, and with purpose. Then he placed the phone face down on his tray table and leaned back, as if the insult from earlier meant nothing at all. 10 minutes later, the flight attendant returned, looking unusually nervous. She cleared her throat softly. "Mr. Johnson, the captain would like to see you for a moment." The man in the blazer chuckled, his arrogance spilling over. Finally, he whispered, "They're moving him out." Passengers nearby exchanged curious looks as Marcus stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked with measured steps toward the cockpit. But instead of being escorted out, Marcus disappeared behind the door with the captain, speaking quietly for several minutes. When the door opened again, both men stepped out together. The captain's tone was firm but respectful as he addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "this aircraft will not be departing yet. A safety review is being conducted at the request of Mr. Marcus Johnson, the CEO of Johnson Aerospace, the very company that built this plane." The words rippled through the cabin like a shockwave. Gasps filled the air, and suddenly every eye that had doubted Marcus was fixed on him in stunned disbelief. The man in the blazer sank into his seat, his smug smile erased in an instant. The cabin was utterly silent, as if the air itself had frozen. A few moments earlier, Marcus had been treated like an intruder in a place he didn't belong. Now, standing beside the captain, he was revealed as the man responsible for ensuring the very plane they sat in was safe enough to fly. The weight of that truth settled heavily on every passenger. The flight attendant who had questioned him stared down at her hands, her face flushed with embarrassment. The man in the blazer looked smaller somehow, his arrogance drained away, his shoulders sinking under the weight of his own shame. Marcus didn't gloat, nor did he raise his voice. He simply spoke with calm authority. "Respect isn't defined by the seat you sit in, the clothes you wear, or the color of your skin," he said evenly. "It's defined by your character and by how you treat others." His words cut deeper than anger ever could. Then, with steady composure, he explained that during boarding, he had noticed a detail in the crew's procedures that was overlooked, something minor to an untrained eye, but critical to safety. Had he stayed silent, it could have put every life on board at risk. His decision to ground the plane wasn't about pride, but about responsibility. The passengers sat still, listening intently, many of them unable to meet his gaze. The man who had sneered at Marcus minutes ago now found himself speechless, his earlier comments echoing back at him like a bitter slap. In that moment, everyone in the cabin understood. The man they had doubted was not only worthy of first class, but he was the reason they would eventually reach their destination safely. The plane remained quiet, but the silence had shifted. It was no longer filled with judgment, but with deep respect. Marcus slowly returned to his seat, his calm presence commanding more authority than any uniform could. Passengers who had once doubted him now stole glances filled with a quiet admiration. A woman across the aisle whispered, "Thank you," while another gave him a respectful nod. The flight attendant who had questioned his ticket earlier stopped beside him, her voice low and apologetic. "I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson. I shouldn't have doubted you." Marcus looked up at her, his expression kind but steady. "Let this be a reminder," he said softly. "We never truly know who someone is or the battles they've already fought just by looking at them." His words carried the weight of experience, reaching every ear in the cabin. Even the man in the blazer, who had mocked him so boldly, sat slumped in shame. He tried to speak, but no words came. Marcus didn't need an apology. His dignity, his restraint, and the truth had already said everything for him. Minutes later, the captain's voice filled the cabin again. "Safety checks are complete. We are cleared for departure." The passengers exhaled as the engines roared to life. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his eyes closing briefly, not in triumph, but in quiet peace. For him, this wasn't about proving a point. It was about reminding people that respect and humility should travel with us wherever we go. As the plane lifted into the sky, those who had judged him carried a lesson they would never forget. Never underestimate a man's worth, for true power needs no announcement. It speaks for itself. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share, and make sure to subscribe to Black Stories for more powerful, true-to-life stories every week.